Close your eyes for a second and imagine an old silent film. What do you see? Most of us picture Charlie Chaplin with his black and white antics and silent, funny expressions. But here's a little known fact. That image you're imagining, with all the charm of early cinema, it didn't happen in Los Angeles. It took place about 350 miles up the coast in a small, unassuming canyon called Niles. Niles is a sleepy little neighborhood nestled in the foothills at the edge of the San Francisco Bay. It's one of those places where time seems to stand still. The main drag, Niles Boulevard, is lined with quaint, old-fashioned shops and an Americana vibe you'd only expect to see in a movie set. There's a silent film museum at the end of the street that honors the area's history as one of America's first film hubs. And up in the hills, perched on a hillside overlooking the town, is a huge white sign that says Niles, a nod to the famous Hollywood sign. But there's more to Niles than its silent film era charm. Beneath the old-fashioned sweetness, the town holds a darker, quieter reputation. For a place its size, Niles has seen an unusual amount of tragic accidents, many tied to the narrow, winding roads that snake through the steep hillsides. Over time, these tragedies have given rise to a collection of ghost stories and urban legends. One of the most chilling tales is about a young girl who appears on the canyon road at night, asking for a ride home. She looks lost and desperate, but anyone who stops to help her is in for a shock. Before they make it out of the canyon, she disappears without a trace, vanishing from the car as if she was never there. Then there's the legend of the White Witch, who roams the nearby woods and whispers about secret societies meeting under the cover of midnight. Some locals even swear they've seen the ghost of Chaplin himself wandering the streets, moving like a character from one of his old films, grayscale and flickering like a projector stuck in time. But the story that really sticks with people is about the secret sidewalk. Hidden deep within the hills, it's a long, mysterious path that weaves its way through the wilderness for miles. Locals have to search hard to find it, but it's one of those places everyone seems to know about, especially kids. The secret sidewalk is a kind of rite of passage in Niles, whispered about from one generation of teenagers to the next. Kids talk about it for years, hearing stories from their older siblings or friends' older brothers, until finally, someone shows them the way. Some of my best memories are from sneaking out there with friends, our backpacks loaded with snacks, flashlights, and the occasional drink, ready to spend a whole day exploring. The sidewalk, though, isn't really a sidewalk at all. It's actually an old aqueduct, built to carry water from the bay to local reservoirs. But it's been out of service for years and is now just a long, hollow structure covered in graffiti and broken in places, leaving open tunnels for anyone brave enough to crawl through. Walking the secret sidewalk feels like you're doing something you're not supposed to, like you're trespassing somewhere forbidden. And if you go in the right season, the fog rolls down from the hills, filling the canyon and spilling over the path like a living thing, shrouding everything in a cold, damp mist. The whole place becomes surreal, and the sense of unease is almost tangible. The thing is, the sidewalk I knew, the one I spent so many afternoons exploring, wasn't the real secret sidewalk. I only found out a few years ago when some friends and I decided to go back for a little nostalgia trip. We were all older by then, way past the age where sneaking around felt rebellious. But we were feeling nostalgic and thought, why not? The place held so many memories for us. When we arrived, everything felt familiar but different. The graffiti had changed, our names lost under layers of paint from younger explorers who'd discovered the spot after us. It felt odd, like we were intruding on a version of our past selves. We wandered for about an hour, but that initial rush of excitement wore off pretty quickly. Eventually, one of us suggested heading back. It was getting late, and honestly, we all felt a little out of place, like adults crashing a party meant for younger kids. As we were getting ready to leave, one of my friends went off into the bushes for a quick bathroom break. When he came back, he had this strange look on his face and said he'd seen something. Of course, being the kind of people who can't resist a bit of mystery, we had to check it out. Pushing through the shrubs, we saw it a narrow path that looked like a real sidewalk, not the broken-down aqueduct we knew so well. The stones were cracked and covered in moss, but there was no mistaking it. It was a sidewalk made of cobblestones that fit together in an almost deliberate way. We jokingly dubbed it the super-secret sidewalk and decided to follow it, curious to see where it led. As we started our walk, something felt different from the beginning. The trail was unusually clean, with not a single bit of litter in sight. No crumpled wrappers, no empty soda cans or scattered bottles, just the quiet crunch of our footsteps as we moved forward. The air itself felt still, almost waiting, as though it knew something we didn't. We kept walking, chatting less than usual, each of us noticing that unusual emptiness in our own way. Then we began to spot things that made us slow down: a faded sweater draped over a low branch, a single shoe lying in the dirt, worn and left behind, as if someone had abandoned it in a hurry. It was strange, out of place. Yet, instead of unsettling us, it sparked a kind of excitement. We joked nervously about how it felt like we'd stumbled onto something forgotten, some hidden relic that had been left behind years ago. As we kept going, though, I noticed something odd beneath our feet. At first, I thought the stones along the trail were just natural rough slabs and pebbles, nothing unusual. But when I looked closer, I saw faint carvings. I knelt down to get a better look, brushing some dirt away. They weren't just scratches, they were actual letters and numbers, old and worn down by time. My heart started to race. I quickly called my friends over, and together we pieced it together. The path we were walking on wasn't made of ordinary stones. It was pieced together from broken headstones, shattered and scattered into a sort of pathway. That realization hit hard, sending an icy shiver down my spine. There was something deeply unsettling about walking over pieces of someone's grave, their names and dates hidden under dirt and debris. But the strangest part was the question that loomed over us. Who would take the time to lay out a path like this? And why? As if on cue, the mood among us shifted. That initial thrill of exploring something unusual started to fade, replaced by a thick tension none of us could ignore. The silence around us felt louder, and with each step, that eerie feeling crept deeper into our bones. Annoyances between us, little things we'd normally brush off, started bubbling to the surface. One friend kicked up dust as he walked, and I found myself irritated by it, snapping at him to watch where he stepped. Another friend muttered under his breath, accusing us of acting like kids, his words just loud enough to stir more tension. The frustration was irrational, but none of us could shake it. It was as if the place itself was affecting us, pressing down on us, heavy and uncomfortable. But despite it all, we didn't stop. Maybe it was pride, maybe stubbornness, or maybe we didn't want to admit that we were scared. Whatever the reason, we kept moving, determined to see where this path would lead. Every now and then, someone would make a weak attempt at a joke, trying to break the tension, but the laughter would quickly die off, lost in the eerie silence surrounding us. After what felt like an eternity, we emerged into a clearing. And there, looming before us, was an old, abandoned train bridge stretching across a ravine. It was massive, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift as we approached. The bridge looked ancient, its metal frame rusted and weathered by decades of exposure. Planks of rotting wood formed the walkway, some of them missing or dangling over the edge, leaving gaps that led straight down into the dark depths below. We stood there, staring up at it in silence. Turning back felt impossible, we'd come too far. And yet, the idea of crossing that bridge sent a fresh wave of fear through me. We all hesitated, glancing at one another, waiting to see who would make the first move. Finally, one of my friends took a deep breath, stepped forward, and started across. The wood creaked under his weight, the sound echoing in the quiet air. One by one, we followed, each step bringing us closer to the center of that decaying bridge. As we moved, the unsettling feeling from earlier returned, stronger than before. The deeper we went, the heavier the air became, like some invisible force was wrapping around us, squeezing tighter and tighter. My heart raced with every step, my pulse thundering in my ears. I glanced down at the ravine below, its steep walls disappearing into darkness, and felt my stomach twist. I focused on the back of the person in front of me, forcing myself to keep moving forward. Halfway across, a sudden wind swept through, whistling through the cracks and gaps, making the bridge sway ever so slightly. I gripped the railing, my knuckles white, trying to steady myself as the bridge groaned and creaked beneath us. My friends all did the same, fear flickering in their eyes as we clung to whatever we could. We exchanged nervous glances, no one daring to speak. Finally, we made it across, stepping onto solid ground with a collective sigh of relief. But that sense of safety was short-lived. Standing there, looking back at the bridge, a strange realization hit us. There were no sounds of wildlife, no birds, no insects, just silence. It was as if the entire area was holding its breath, watching us. We exchanged uneasy glances, each of us silently agreeing that it was time to leave. We hurried back the way we came, barely speaking. The eerie path with the broken headstones, the abandoned sweater and shoe, the strange tension between us, it all felt wrong now, like we'd disturbed something that should have been left alone. And as we finally reached the trailhead and stepped back into familiar ground, I looked back one last time. The bridge stood silently in the distance, a haunting reminder of the strange and terrifying walk we'd just taken. None of us spoke about it after that, but I knew we all felt the same, a deep, lingering sense that we'd encountered something beyond our understanding, something that would stay with us for a long time. One by one, we made our way across, gripping the railing and trying not to look down. The creak of the wood underfoot echoed in the silence, and every step felt like it could be our last. By the time we reached the other side, my heart was racing, and I could tell the others felt the same. But none of us said anything. We just kept walking, the unease growing with each step. Finally, the path came to an end at a small clearing surrounded by trees. In the center was an old, weathered statue, half buried in the ground. It was hard to make out what it was, but it looked like some kind of angel, wings spread wide and face worn away by time and weather. There was something unsettling about it, like it was watching us, judging us. We stood there in silence, unsure of what to do. The air felt thick, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I wanted to leave, but something held me there, like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. Then, without warning, the fog rolled in, creeping through the trees and filling the clearing. It swirled around the statue, wrapping it in a ghostly shroud. That was the breaking point. One of my friends muttered, "We need to go." And without another word, we turned and started back the way we came. The walk back felt endless, each step heavier than the last. The arguments that had started earlier flared up again, sharper this time, almost cruel. We snapped at each other, our words biting and bitter, as if the place itself was seeping into us, twisting us. When we finally made it back to the original secret sidewalk, the air felt lighter and the tension started to fade. We walked in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. None of us spoke about what we'd seen or the strange path we'd discovered. It felt like something we were better off forgetting, a place we weren't meant to find. To this day, I don't know what we experienced out there. Maybe it was just our minds playing tricks on us. Or maybe there really was something strange in those hills. All I know is that we never went back, and I never want to. The hike was supposed to be fun, something to shake up our routine and give us a story to laugh about later. But from the beginning, something didn't feel right. The air seemed thicker, and we all felt a weird unease, though no one dared say it aloud. Looking back, it's strange. We were all uncomfortable, clearly not having a good time, yet none of us suggested turning around. It was as if some invisible force was drawing us deeper into that quiet, eerie trail, past our own doubts and second thoughts. After what felt like hours, the narrow sidewalk finally curved one last time. We expected to see something amazing, a hidden waterfall, an overlook, anything that would make the hike worth it. But all we found was an empty field, just an expanse of yellow, brittle grass, surrounded by sloping hills that felt like walls. It was anticlimactic, like the disappointing ending of a movie that just fades to black. I think one of us even muttered, "That's it?" We had walked for what felt like forever, and this desolate field was our reward. The field lay in a hollow, surrounded by hills that seemed to close in around it, forming an eerie natural amphitheater. The dry grass crunched beneath our feet as we walked forward, and smack in the middle of that barren space stood a single tree, ancient, lifeless, its bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Odd, considering it was late spring. We'd had plenty of rain, enough to make everything green. But this tree, it looked like it hadn't felt life in decades. Disappointed, we stood there in silence, taking in the sight. Then, something caught my eye. Scattered around the base of the tree were pieces of wood, some splintered, some charred black as if scorched by fire. They didn't look like branches, but rather parts of an old structure, almost like the remains of a shelter. The urge to investigate was strong. Maybe curiosity, maybe something else. But we felt compelled to go off the path, to see what those pieces of wood had once belonged to. The second we stepped off the trail, the air around us shifted. It was subtle, a barely there heaviness, but enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The wood looked ancient, warped, and brittle, as if it had been exposed to countless winters and scorching summers. Some pieces looked like they'd once fit together, forming walls or floors, though it was impossible to tell if it had been a house, a cabin, or maybe even a shed. The longer we stared, the more details we noticed: the blackened edges, the brittle texture, as if the wood had been half burned, half decayed over time. My friends tried to arrange the pieces, curious to see if they could reconstruct whatever had stood here. But my focus was elsewhere. That tree, it held my gaze like a magnet. One branch in particular seemed to call to me. I couldn't look away, even though nothing about it was visibly different. I was transfixed. The world around me faded, and a faint sound filled my ears. It was soft, rhythmic, like a creaking swing in the distance, though there was no wind and the tree itself wasn't moving. The sound grew louder, more persistent, almost like it was whispering, calling out to me. I stood there, staring, unable to break my gaze, my sense of time slipping away. A minute or an hour could have passed, and I wouldn't have known the difference. All I knew was that the branch was speaking to me, its silent call as clear as a voice in the dead of night. I felt something in my gut, a knot tightening, warning me to look away. But I couldn't. Then, finally, I heard my friends calling my name, their voices faint and distant. When I turned to them, they looked wrong. Each one was staring, but not at me around me. Their faces had shifted, their usual carefree expressions replaced with confusion and fear. They looked as if they were seeing something over my shoulder, something they couldn't quite process. Their eyes darted around, each one focused on something different. It was unsettling. They weren't looking at the same thing, yet they were all staring past me, like I was a shadow they had only just realized was standing among them. I called out, asked what they were seeing, but none of them gave a straight answer. "I don't know," one of them muttered, his eyes wide, unblinking. "It's nothing, I guess," another whispered, though the fear in his voice was unmistakable. The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable. Finally, without another word, we turned and started walking back. But something in me, a strange, powerful urge, made me turn back for one last look at the field. And that's when I saw it. Under the tree, nestled in the shadows, was a figure. It wasn't fully there, more like a smudge, a shadow too dark for the light, with two piercing, reflective eyes staring back at me. It looked like a fuzzy blur, like static on an old TV, shifting and changing, almost like it was pulsing in time with my heartbeat. My mouth went dry. My mind screamed at me to look away, but my eyes were locked onto those two glowing points in the darkness. We never talked about that day again, not openly, anyway. I tried bringing it up a few times, hoping someone would say something that made sense, but it was like pulling teeth. Every once in a while, one of them would let something slip, half-remembered images, strange dreams, snippets of what they thought they'd seen. But no one else mentioned the shadow under the tree with those terrible, glowing eyes. In fact, no one seemed to have seen the same thing. One friend described two big shapes moving in the field. Another saw smaller, faint figures linked together. And one friend swore he saw shapes colliding in a chaotic blur. The inconsistency was baffling, like each of us had been in a different place that day. And yet, somehow, it was all the same. Our friendships changed after that. Slowly, subtly, we drifted apart. We all had our reasons, I suppose. Some got married, some moved for jobs or family. One by one, they left Texas, Minnesota, Idaho, even Hollywood. It was as if they were all trying to get as far from that field as possible. And maybe they were. But I stayed, though I couldn't say why. It was almost like I couldn't leave, like the tree's roots were somehow tangled in my own. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel its pull again. I'll be going through my day, and out of nowhere, I'll remember that hollow field, the skeletal tree, the way the air felt charged, heavy. The memory clings to me, dark and unshakable, and I can almost hear that creak, that slow, rhythmic sound echoing in my ears. On the loneliest nights, when I try to remember my friends, I don't hear their laughter or their voices anymore. Instead, I hear the back and forth groan of that branch, swaying in a wind that doesn't exist. I can't help but wonder if they still feel it too, even miles away, in their new lives. If that place haunts their dreams the way it haunts mine. We were just kids back then, looking for an adventure, a story to tell. Instead, we found something that none of us could ever truly escape. And maybe we never will. I don't know the answers. But if you think you've had a brush with something sinister, or if you've ever experienced a moment where you felt like you were being watched, don't keep it to yourself. Share your story with me in the comments below. And if you want to hear more terrifying tales, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. You never know when the next story will be about you. Stay safe out there, and remember, not everything you see is what it seems.